public purse by our taxes, and they're charged with managing the money supply and keeping the value of the currencies in all these countries. But there's no real connection between average citizens and the BIS itself. So my argument is that the BIS remains largely unaccountable.
I guess from the inception, why did the U.S. originally not participate in the bank, even though when you look at the bank's history, the first presidents were Americans?
The American relationship with the BIS is interesting and is quite contradictory and ambivalent. The BIS was born out of something called the Young Plan, which was the plan masterminded by Owen Young, an American businessman and diplomat, to oversee the reparations payments for the First World War for Germany in the late 1920s and in 1930. So the BIS has always had an American connection. And its first two presidents were American. Gates McGarrah was its first president. He was American. And then also during the Second World War, as I said, Thomas McKittrick was its president, and he was American too, and the bank had another American president as well. So there's always been this American connection, but at the same time, especially when you think of the United States during the 1930s, there's a really strong feeling that we don't want anything to do with international institutions. I mean, remember the United States joined the League of Nations, even though under Woodrow Wilson it kind of helped set the League of Nations up. So there was a fear that if they had anything to do with the BIS, it would be able to interfere in American domestic politics and economic policy making. So they didn't have anything to do with it. And the American shares were given to a tranche of private banks. But eventually, when the BIS's role changed in the 1980s and 1990s, and it became much more global, the Federal Reserve took up its shares. The Federal Reserve and also the Federal Reserve in New York are both members of the BIS now.
Adam, the bank had three reasons when it was originally set up. The first, and ostensibly the most important, was to manage German reparations. The second was to facilitate cooperation between central banks. And the third was to act as a bank for central banks. About 5 years into its existence, by 1935, it had already lost its primary reason for existence, and the second was under threat.
Yes, and that's an example of how the BIS has been so clever through the years, reinventing itself. It's a very agile institution. You know, when we think of international institutions like the United Nations or the International Monetary Fund, we think of these huge lumbering beasts, you know, like cruise ships that take, you know, half a day to change direction. But the BIS is small and it's nimble, and it's always had a very good radar as to what was going on. So as you say, yes, it was invented to mainly oversee German reparations payments, but they'd stopped by 1933. So really the bank didn't need to exist. So it reinvented itself partly as a place where central bankers meet. And also what's interesting about the BIS is that it's really the place where the global technocrats, the global financial technocrats were invented. And if you've ever wondered, how did we actually get to this position where these middle-aged men in suits are flying off to Athens or the developing world and whatever and telling them, you know, this is what you have to do with your economy? It started at the BIS. The BIS organized some of the first bailouts for Spain and Austria and Hungary during the 1930s. And so this is where it all began. And then, of course, during the Second World War, the BIS was a prime point of contact between the Allies and the Nazis for post-war planning, because even though the countries were at war, there was contacts going on as to how they were going to get the money flowing after the war, much of which ran through Thomas McKittrick. And there were strong attempts to close the bank down. Henry Morgenthau, the Treasury Secretary, and Harry Dexter White, his assistant, one of his senior officials, pushed very hard for the BIS to be shut down at Bretton Woods in 1944. Bretton Woods was the conference where the planning was done for the post-war economy. But the BIS had very powerful friends in the Treasury Department, in the State Department. Alan Dulles was the head of the American intelligence operation in Switzerland, was a very strong friend of the BIS and was also a friend of Thomas McKittrick's, the bank's president. So the BIS survived and reinvented itself in the 50s, 60s and 70s as a place, again, where central bankers could meet, but also as a place where a lot of the planning was done for the single European currency. Because before the euro was introduced, you know, the euro was introduced at the end of the 1990s. Most people thought it was something out of the blue. Oh, look, we've got this new European currency. But of course, there have been decades of planning and preparation for that. And a lot of the technical work was done at the BIS.
I want to discuss probably what is considered one of the dark periods in the bank's history, and that's the bank's connection to the Third Reich from Schacht to the president of and CEO of IG Farben. Explain that and how that evolved, because it was really considered one of the darker moments in the bank's history.
Yeah, it was the darkest moment in the bank's history, I would say, and that's why at the end of the war, Henry Morgenthau and Harry Dexter White and many others said the bank should be shut down. When the bank started, it was set up by Schacht, and Schacht was a director of the bank. And when he stepped down as president of the Reichsbank, the new president of the Reichsbank was also director of the bank, a man called Walter Funk, as was his deputy, a man called Emil Pohl. For some time, a German private banker called Kurt von Schroeder was a director of the bank, and so was a man called Hermann Schmitz. Hermann Schmitz was the boss of IG Farben. IG Farben was the giant German chemicals and industrial conglomerate that basically was the key manufacturer for the German war machine. Without IG Farben, Germany couldn't have gone to war. And a subsidiary of IG Farben made Zyklon B, the gas that was used to kill the Jews. IG Farben also ran its own concentration camp at Auschwitz. It had its own kind of private corporate concentration camp where they manufactured Buna, which was artificial rubber, which was needed for tires, among other things. And so the BIS during the war was absolutely thoroughly entangled with the Third Reich. And after the war, a total of 5 BIS directors were put on trial for war crimes. And Schacht himself was eventually found not guilty, and the others were found guilty but served quite short terms. But there was a very strong sense, driven in part by Alan Dulles, that the priority was really to rebuild the German economy, that while dreadful things had happened, and the industrialists were part of that, the priority was to rebuild Germany as a bulwark against the Soviet Union and against communism. But if you remember, at that time, the Iron Curtain had just come down and half of the continent had been shut off and was ruled by the Soviets.
You know, another dark moment in the bank's history, Hitler invades Czechoslovakia. Novel idea. He invades the country, annexes it, and then demands the annexed states supply the gold to pay for the loss of the territory. Now, prior to the invasion, Czechoslovakia's bank had shipped, I guess, their gold to England and the BIS. Why did the BIS give in to the Nazi demands and basically ship the gold or credit it to the Nazi account?
The Czechoslovakian government had sent, a kind of obviously anticipating that the country was in extreme danger, had transferred some of its national reserves to its account at the BIS, which was actually held at the Bank of England. And when the Germans invaded Czechoslovakia in March 1939, they marched over to the National Bank and held the governor at gunpoint and said, you order the BIS and the Bank of England to transfer your reserves to the German sub-account at the BIS. And they did so because they were threatened with death, basically, if they refused to obey. And anyone could have seen that such an order had been issued under duress. But for the BIS, and also very much for the Bank of England, and Montague Norman was key in this, as long as the paperwork went through, then the transfer went through. You know, the fact that this was done under duress, held at gunpoint, that this was the Third Reich basically stealing a country's national reserves, that didn't matter because the order had been made, and so the order went through and the transfer took place. This caused uproar in Britain and a lot of concern in America as well. Not to mention, profound anger in Czechoslovakia, but the money was transferred, and so Germany gained a large amount of gold without having to fire a shot because of the bureaucratic mentality of the time.
You know, something that you talk about in your book is with the Czech affair, it really highlighted the bank's increasing sophisticated gold operations, which were growing in reach and importance, which is still part of the bank's operations today.
Gold has always been very important for the BIS. The BIS's official historian and Italian historian, Professor Toniolo, says that gold is part of the DNA of the BIS because in the 1930s, the transfers and the financial transactions that the BIS were doing, many of them were done on the gold standard, and there was this idea, gold holds a special place in our psyche, really, that for many of us, gold is the ultimate store of value. And even now, the BIS has substantial reserves. I believe it's the country in the world with the 30th largest reserves, so something like 119 tons. It's got more gold than Qatar and Canada. And the BIS also does a lot of gold swaps for other central banks. So gold's always been very important to BIS and remains so.
Something that when the war broke out, the management of the bank were facing three options. They could liquidate the bank, downsize and become dormant until the end of hostilities, or remain as active as possible. Tell us a little bit about that, because they were looking ahead to basically what happens after the war. In other words, the reconstruction that would follow.
As I said, the BIS managers have always been very clever at realizing which way the wind is blowing. And they could see, virtually as soon as the war started, or even before it started, that this war is going to carry on. It's going to be awful, and people are going to die, and countries are going to be laid waste. But after that, trade is going to have to restart. And maybe they're going to invent something new like the World Bank or the IMF, but they won't have any experience. Whereas we've been here for 15 years, and we know all about moving money between countries and central banks and the global economy and how that works. So they worked very hard to make sure that the bank survived. I mean, they thought that the best thing to do, it really was the only choice, is, downsize, keep quiet, and let's just survive, and then we'll rebuild after the war. But during the war, they did some terrible things. They accepted looted Nazi gold, and they also did some more subtle things, such as essentially recognizing the Nazi puppet regimes when countries invaded. When the Germans invaded a country like Belgium or Poland, they set up a puppet government to say, that to have the fiction that that there's some kind of local input into this to different degrees depending on the country. And the BIS recognized these puppet governments. Instead of saying that, we don't recognize you because you've been invaded by the Germans, they did recognize them. So the BIS did a lot to ensure that the Third Reich, that Nazi Germany could continue functioning in the wartime global economy.
I want to talk about and move on to its president, McKittrick. And, he gave a prediction that he made that was almost like a prophecy that turned out to be true when he was talking to one of the individuals in Germany, that he had this feeling that something would happen that would get the U.S. involved. And I think, was it Poole who made the comment? He said, "My God, if you're right, we've lost the war."
Thomas McKittrick was extremely well connected. He was an American lawyer and a banker who lived in London for a long time before he moved out to Basel. And he had very good contacts. He was especially very well connected to Alan Dulles. Now, during the 1930s, Alan Dulles was a lawyer for a company called Sullivan and Cromwell, as was his brother, John Foster Dulles. And Sullivan and Cromwell was really a key point in channeling a lot of American money to Nazi Germany, to local governments, to companies, to sort of sorting out American investments in Germany. Now, to be fair, other countries were doing this as well. I mean, Britain, lots of British banks were doing that as well, and all sorts of countries were doing business with Germany. But there's no doubt that Alan and John Foster Dulles were important players in the money channel that ran from Wall Street to Berlin. And so where the money is usually where there's very good political intelligence as well. So McKittrick realized that, America is going to enter the war sooner or later. And when he told Emil Poole that, and Emil Poole was the vice president of the Vice Bank, as you say, he realized that really once America enters the war, it's all over, because Germany can't beat America.
I want to move forward to the modern world. The bank began as a depository, and then all of a sudden it also began to accumulate a large body of data, of statistics on banking, making it one of the best informed financial institutions in the world. And especially